The plot of one of the great movies of all time involves looking for the Ark of the Covenant. Anybody ever seen that movie? Right? Indiana Jones is racing to find the Ark of the Covenant before the Nazis do. Finding the Ark of the Covenant has been the subject of a lot of speculation. In fact, you can get on the internet, you can read all sorts of stuff. It gets quite strange about just where is the Ark of the Covenant, if it even exists to this day. Some believe the Ark is in Ethiopia. Some believe it's somewhere in Jordan. Some believe it's someplace in Iraq. Some believe it's actually under the Temple Mount, buried underneath that Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Originally, the Ark of the Covenant was the main piece of furniture in the inner sanctum of what was the tabernacle and then the temple. Now the tabernacle, this is a picture of the tabernacle. Tabernacle was a movable building. It was a movable tent. The temple, by the way, mimicked a lot of what you see here in a permanent way, but this is how they traveled through the wilderness. Everybody had a task. They were all carrying. Everybody had to carry something here. But this was mobile. And the reason it was mobile is because this was God's dwelling place. God was always moving with his people. Wherever the people went, God was there. In fact, wherever God went, the people were to follow. But you see, this what is the inner sanctum, in this inner place, what we call the Holy of Holies, was this Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark was significant. This Ark was overlaid with gold, and it had two cherubim that were facing each other, and their wings almost touched each other. But the Ark was significant. This Ark, the way it's set up, was not only where God was present among his people, but this is where he ruled his people. That Ark was a throne. God's throne on earth. So, you see the glory cloud here with the Ark of the Covenant being carried. They're always carried on poles, but this glory cloud was God's visible presence. So no matter where you were camping in Israel in the wilderness, you could look in any direction, and then wherever you saw this glory cloud, God's presence, hey, there's God. God's with us. And it rested with this Ark of the Covenant. Now, this was God's house on earth. And like I said, this is where God ruled his people from his throne. But here's the thing about the Ark of the Covenant and all the speculation. It doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter. Does it exist? I don't know. Yeah, if they found the Ark of the Covenant, that would be some kind of real historical find. But how it affects history, how it affects us, how it affects anything that we're doing, doesn't matter anymore, because it's all been fulfilled. It's been replaced by Jesus. You see, Jesus is that glory cloud in the Old Testament. And once he took on flesh, no need for that anymore. In the place of this ark, in the place of this glory cloud, in the place of the tabernacle and the temple, we have a person. And as the writer of Hebrews is making his argument, he's basically saying, Jesus is better than all of this. Why would you ever go back to this? Because Jesus is better than all of this. And last week we looked at Jesus is a better high priest. That's the main argument of Hebrews. You don't need the high priest, you need the high priest system. Now, we're looking at this passage this morning. We're talking about all these things again this morning. Because if Jesus has now, as a person, fulfilled everything that was anticipated in all of that, that does have some immediate implications for us here. It has some immediate implications for this church to which this writer, this preacher is preaching. Now, one thing we're going to do this morning again, because we are in Hebrews, we're going to go back and look at the summary of Hebrews. So this is the book of Hebrews. If we're going to understand our text today, again, sorry for the small font, but we got this. This is the summary. This is the whole summary of Hebrews. So, we don't know who wrote it, right? Carlos, I'm sure you have an opinion, right? We don't know who wrote it. Many think Paul wrote it. But, again, we don't know. What we do know in Hebrews is a sermon. It was preached. And again, if you think sermons are long these days, think about trying to sit through all 13 chapters of Hebrews. Hebrews was written to Jewish Christians. They were primarily Jewish. There's probably some Gentile element or non-Jewish people in the gatherings where this was being preached. It was mainly Jewish Christians. It was written to Jewish Christians who are enduring severe persecution. Some are being thrown in jail. They're probably, it talks about even their property is at risk. And so they are tempted to leave Christianity. The reason this whole thing is written is because all of a sudden, with all this heat, with all this persecution, with all this suffering, what they had with Moses, what they had in the synagogue, what they had in Judaism seems a whole lot better than what they got now following this Jesus guy. We want to go back. And so Hebrews was written to warn the church against abandoning Jesus. And how does he do that? Well, it was written to show that Jesus is better than that. What you've got, in spite of all this persecution, in spite of all this suffering, what you have in Jesus is a whole lot better than what you had. It might not look that way, but Jesus is better than the angels. Jesus is better than Moses. Jesus is better than the sacrifice. Jesus is better than the high priest you had. He's better than everything you had, everything you knew. And then the main one of all these better thans that he's preaching about, the main one is Jesus is a better high priest. He's a better high priest. So we looked at that last week. Jesus is the better high priest. He's the one who's made peace between the Creator and his creatures. He's the one, the high priest who was actually the sacrifice. He's the one that cleared the way in giving us access to God. We're going to look at that a little bit again this morning. So Jesus is better than everything. Everything. Now, we mentioned this last week, and I have to say it again. This isn't dry theology. It may seem like dry theology as we're reading through it. And like I said, the preacher even makes a comment as he's preaching, you know what, this might seem, this is actually milk to you. I'm like, milk? It seems like meat to me. No, these are basics. These are basics. He wants us to see. And it's not simply dry theology. He's trying to make a point. A real life point. Don't go back to that. What you have everything here in your gathering. This church. Jesus is the high priest who brings us to God. And because he's that high priest, now he's going to show us, okay, this is what this gathering looks like, and this is why Jesus is better than. It actually has some practical implications. Something that we need to remind ourselves every week when we walk through those doors. So, here's what we read moments ago. Since we have boldness to enter the sanctuary through the blood of Jesus, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God, then he's going to make a statement. But there's two senses here. Making sense of the senses. Since we have boldness to enter the sanctuary, when he's talking about the sanctuary now, he's talking about the gathering. He's talking about the heavenly gathering that is part of this. We're not going to get into all that. He gets into that in chapters 11, 12, and 13. But since we have boldness to enter the sanctuary, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God, us. Because we have access to God now, and because we are now the house of God, we are the tabernacle, we are the temple, because we're all this, now he's going to make his case. Okay, here's what's happening when you gather together. In fact, here's your identity as a church. This is what's going on when you meet together. So, having made the case that Jesus has opened the way, he's given us access to God, we enter the sanctuary, God's throne room, because we're the house of God. There are 3 activities that he talks about as being involved in. And all 3 of these are involved in what we call church. I'm going to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about that word. Because that word has everything to do with these 3 activities. So what is church? What is church? Again, you can get on the internet and you can find hundreds of definitions. The definition we run with here is one that has been around for centuries. We define the church as the place or location, it's a place, our gathering is someplace, all right? Place or location where the gospel is proclaimed and the table, or the sacraments, are rightly provided. Sometimes you'll see the word administered, just a fancy way of saying provided, all right? Where the gospel is proclaimed, wherever the gospel is proclaimed, and wherever the sacraments are provided. We've talked here at the table about being mobile church, because you can do this anywhere, by the place of location. It's not a building. Now, at some point we will have a permanent place. But know full well Jesus is wherever this is happening. So we can gather anywhere. And that's church. Now, church itself, the reason I'm spending some time here, can have a lot of baggage. Many of us have been burned by church. And even using that word, again, if I say the word church, all of a sudden you've got all sorts of, and I have all sorts of ideas and understandings of what that means. And a lot of it, in my experience, isn't good. My own personal experience. We've all been there. Now, church is a place where we find community. Church is a place where people get married. Emily and I got married in church. Raised our kids in church. We have friends. We meet friends here. And some of us, and some of you have seen your kids get married in church. Here in the Valley, church also carries a little bit of the idea of a family business, right? Some of you have been in church like that. You may think of church as family, but church is what Dad did. Church is what the sons are doing. It's passed down from father to son as if it's a family business. Church is what Dad did, so now that's what everybody else is doing. Grandfather did this way back when. It's the same church. So instead of Dad being a plumber, that's somebody, a pastor, has his own business, a church. So that also can color the way we think and talk about church. Even the activities that we engage in here at the table, we're highly contextualized by this understanding of church. And for many, though, church hasn't been a place that's very happy. And some of you watching on the internet right now may be there. You might be watching on the internet because church hasn't been a happy place for you. I get that. You don't gather in worship. People don't gather in worship because, and I've had people tell me, I've had people sitting right where Carlos is sitting at the table. And they don't frequent here because when they're sitting where Carlos is sitting, all they're thinking about is all the bad stuff that's happened to them at a church. I get that. I understand that. So this preacher who is preaching this book that we call Hebrews, this sermon, is unpacking for us what church is supposed to look like. When you take away all the trappings and take away all the context for church, what are we supposed to be doing? What are the activities? Well, the place that we need to start is where we started this morning, when we see that Jesus is the high priest over the house of God. One of the things that you pick up on as you read the New Testament is that Jesus was sold on church. People don't like to say that these days because of all the baggage that comes with the word church. But Jesus was sold on it. He died for the church. In fact, the writer of Hebrews is making this case, that Jesus died for this gathering. He died for the people to whom Hebrews is being preached for the first time in the first century. He died for this. He's the one that created all this. So what it means is one of the things it means when we say we have a high priest over the house of God, Jesus. He died to bring about and to create this house of God. So we have to start there. And this house of God is us. This is how much Jesus loves us. The gathering is where he has chosen to be. It's where he chooses to dwell. It's no longer the tabernacle or temple. We're the tabernacle. We are the temple as we gather. The temple's not needed anymore. So this gathering is where Jesus has chosen to dwell and to give us of himself. That's why we talk about where the gospel or the word is proclaimed and the sacraments provided. Jesus is giving us himself. There's all sorts of ways that we can experience Jesus throughout the week. And it's all still true. But there's still something different going on when we gather together. This is where Jesus has promised to be with us and meet us in a different kind of way. And this is good news for us. This is why we say, and you've picked up on it as in our social media, this is why we say, when we're talking about the table and the 10:30 gathering on Sunday, Jesus is going to be there. Why? Because he promised. He promised. There's a lot of things I can't guarantee you about the table. There's a lot of things that can't be guaranteed about church. But the one thing that you know is that as long as the gospel is proclaimed here, as long as what Jesus has done for you and is providing to you is proclaimed and is given to you, as long as all of it is happening, we can guarantee that Jesus is here. And Jesus is here for you. That's how much he loves you. He's promised you that. And even though the table in any other church is going to have all sorts of issues and baggage. I mean, say, well, we've been in existence for 5 years and we're not perfect. But I can always guarantee you this. As long as we're here proclaiming gospel, providing sacrament, we can say that Jesus is here. He promised. Now, because this is Jesus' home then, here's what he says he's going to do through his gathering. There's actually 3 commands that show up. In everything that follows, Jesus bringing the high priest over the house of God. What does that mean? Okay, here's what this means. And in our English, all of these commands start with the words, let us. These 2 words. And you get on the internet and people have fancy things for the lettuce salad of Hebrews 10, whatever. But let us. Let us. There are 3 of these statements here. The first one is, let us draw near. Let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed in pure water. There's the echoes of Ezekiel 36. Let us draw near. Remember what we said about Jesus being the high priest over the house of God and how he has opened a way in the sanctuary? That's what this is talking about. Let us draw near to God. There's probably a lot of myth-busting going on this morning. Again, we're taught to think in our evangelicalism that drawing near is, well, I get over here in my prayer closet, I sit down and I have my little prayer time with God, and I'm drawing near to God doing that. Now, we can't do that. That is part of it. But he's talking about the assembly. When we gather here, we are drawing near to Jesus. What is it that they need to hear in their lives as if they're being tempted to go back into Judaism and just chuck the whole Jesus thing? He's basically saying, do you understand that you're not near Jesus anymore? You're not near God doing that. That God is here. And when we gather, we are drawing near. So let us draw near. And he's talking about baptism here as well. What we're doing, because we have been baptized, because we have been made God's children, we draw near to Jesus when we gather. You see, drawing near to God, you couldn't do that in the Old Testament. Some guys tried it, and it didn't turn out well for them. You couldn't just bust in to the Holy of Holies, hey, I need some time with God. In fact, there was only one guy that could do that once a year. That was the high priest. And that was the only time. Now, because Jesus is our high priest, because that veil has been torn in his death, the sanctuary's open, allowing us to draw near. Anybody. To draw near to Jesus in the gathering. This gathering is where God dwells among his people. And then there's the second let us. Let us hold fast to our confession. Back to one. There we go. Thank you. Let's hold on to the confession of our hope without wavering, since he who promised is... By the way, who's he who promised? Jesus, right? Okay. So again, we could spend a lot of time on all these different things. We're not going to. Just those first few words, let us hold on to the confession. Why is it that we start every gathering with some version of, this morning we used the words of the creed. Sometimes we sing it, thanks to Howell, and some good songs that are out there. Why is it that we confess our faith as a body together? This, again, remember what's going on in the life of that community. They are being tempted to go back to their old life, go back to what they're familiar with, go back to Moses, go back to all the stuff that they knew in Judaism. He's making the argument that Jesus is better than. But one of the things that happens in the gathering is, when we're in the gathering, we are holding fast to the confession. When we start forgetting about Jesus, when we start forgetting about how good Jesus is to us and for us, what's one of the first things that we do? We don't show up. We don't show up to church. When something bad happens in life, and I've been there, when something bad happens, I don't feel like going to church. But he's telling us that it should actually be the opposite. When you're being tempted to leave your faith, when you're tempted to leave Jesus behind, when you just don't want to really deal with Jesus right now, you know where you need to be? In the gathering. Let's hold fast to our confession. How is it that we hold fast? We hold fast to our confession together. Let us. By the way, the preacher's including himself in this when he says us. He's not saying let you, he's saying let us. So that's why I always say, on a bad week, when Preston is having a bad week, you know where I want to run? I can't wait for Sunday, because that's where my confession is going to remind me of Jesus having me and what he's done for me. That I'm his. And that's my identity. That all happens as we hold fast. That's why we spend time with our confession of faith, because that's how we stay connected to Jesus with each other. And then there's the third let us. It's the third command. Let us consider one another in order to provoke love and good works. It's fascinating how he writes this or preaches this. He says, let us consider one another. Very easy to just jump. Let us consider all the good works we're supposed to be doing. That's kind of part of what he's saying here, but he doesn't go there first. Let us consider one another. Part of church is I need you, you need me, we need we. There's a lot of, and again, that kind of runs against the grain of our culture, where we have our rugged American individualism, like, I can do this on my own, right? No, I need Bob. And you know what the sorry thing about that is, Bob, you need me. We do. We need each other. We need each other. Let us consider one another. And then as we consider one another, as we are thinking about how we can be a community together, we're provoking each other to love and good works. So those are the three commands. That's what we are doing when we gather. Let us draw near. Let us confess our faith. Let us consider one another. That's church in a nutshell. Now, we're going to myth bust this last piece here because when I was growing up, this is the only verse that I even heard out of this whole passage my entire early existence. Not neglecting to gather together as some are in the habit of doing. Remember how I said some are being tempted to leave? Got people already doing that. Not neglecting, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging each other. Again, there's this idea of considering one another. And all the more as you see the day, that's Jesus, resurrection day for us, you see the day approaching. Now that verse, we were hammered not neglecting to gather together, as if that is the command of this. That's not the command here. It's actually, and if you understand even English, it's a participle that is connected to the entire paragraph ahead of it. It's kind of qualifying everything you just said. Here's why you don't neglect. You know why we don't neglect gathering together? Well, it's so we can draw near, so we can confess our faith, so we can consider one another. Now, I was taught that verse is commanding me to never miss a church service whenever the doors of the church are open. How many of you have heard that? I grew up with that. That's not what this is saying. This is simply saying, don't neglect getting together, because in neglecting getting together, you're not able to draw near. You're not even able to confess your faith. You're not able to consider one another. You're not able to do all the things you need with Jesus being a high priest over the house of God. I need you. You need me. We need we. Say that together. We need we. We need we. And that's why we don't neglect the gathering. Not saying that you're sinning anytime you skip the gathering. And I was raised to think that way. That is not what that is saying. So, this is what the church of Hebrews needed to hear. It's what we need to hear. Now, I wanted to end this little snapshot of Hebrews these last couple of weeks, because again, we can begin to think, okay, Jesus is better than it. It becomes abstract. It becomes kind of distant from us. What does this mean for us? Why is this important? Well, because all the same things are true. If we're not here, we're not drawing near. If we're not here, we're not confessing our faith. If we're not here, we're not helping encourage one another. There are practical implications for Jesus being the high priest over the house of God. This is what he has done for us. This is why he has gathered us. He's the one that put this all together. And it's for you and it's for me. What's fascinating is then as he actually continues making this case that Jesus is the high priest over the house of God and that we're doing all these things when we gather together, he's then going to say, you know what, every time you gather, this is an outpost of heaven. It's chapter 12. This is an outpost of heaven. This is all the stuff that eventually we're going to be doing once we do see Jesus face to face. We're going to be encouraging one another. We're going to be confessing our faith together. We're drawing near together. You know what's true about then as it is now? This is a fascinating thing. Did you know that we is also true in the new heavens and new earth? I don't think we don't think about heaven that way. We need we. We're in this together. Like it or not. Bob? This is what Jesus has done and is doing for us. So that's why he then says, hold on. Hold fast. Hold on. Jesus has promised. Jesus has promised to do all of this for us. He's already done this for us. He has given us life. He has given us forgiveness. He has given us peace. And he continues to do it as we gather. So when we're tempted to, and when we are thinking, I need to chuck this. And when I'm having a bad day, I don't need this. Hold on. Hold fast. Hold tight to Jesus. And the fascinating thing about all of that is, as we hold tight to Jesus, we find he's already holding tight to us. He promised. Let's pray.